the Nazis really all about, and is that a good way to spend £60 million of public money restoring the Nuremberg Stadium? Plus, Martin Summers takes us on a tour of the world's hot spots, not so hot as they were last week, thank goodness. Anyway, Martin, let's start there, and let's start with Syria. What's the latest?
Well, as I understand it, they're now talking about Syria joining the Chemical Weapons Convention, and that seems to have pushed back any military strikes by the US for now. But Assad is saying he wants the Israelis to join the convention, and he wants to guarantee that he's not going to be attacked. So in other words, the Americans could then use that as he's not being serious and so on. The danger of war is still very much there. The war is going on. There's been fighting this week between Kurdish Peshmerga and the Al-Nusra front in northern Syria. This is far more complicated than people realise. The KDP, who run the Kurdish Democratic Party, who run northern Iraq, their Peshmerga may come over the border to join in the fight against the Al-Nusra front. And so it's a bit like Lebanon was in the 1980s. There's more than two sides in the battle. There's all these different factions, some of them ethnically based, some of them ideologically based, are fighting with each other as they fight the government or on the government. The government side, in fact, is relatively cohesive, but the rebels are split into at least 100 factions, I understand.
And one of the things that Amy Goodman has pointed out at Truth Dig, I mean, she's also does other things on the internet, but she wrote a special article for the 9/11 anniversary this week, the September the 11th anniversary, 12th anniversary, and she's pointing out that actually on the very same day that Secretary of State John Kerry was meeting with one of his predecessors, a certain Henry Kissinger, to discuss the strategy on the forthcoming negotiations on Syria with Russian officials. So Kerry is apparently been discussing this with Russian officials, but first he goes and asks Kissinger, what should I say? Is this normal for him to go and chat to an old Secretary of State from the Nixon era to get a bit of advice?
Yeah, and somebody who's regarded by many as a war criminal. For the bombing of Cambodia, amongst other things. I mean, this just goes to show that the US establishment does not perceive how it is itself perceived in the rest of the world. There's evidence coming out, I've been following this very closely, the evidence is coming out that Western intelligence services working with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, A, started the whole war in Syria in the first place, B, the chemical weapons attack outside Damascus was probably carried out by them in order to try and get an airstrike going. Now, if we find that Western intelligence services, MI6 for example, were involved in a chemical weapons attack in Damascus, what should we do about that?
Well, I mean,
we were threatening.
Mark, can you just flesh that out a little bit and stand it up? Because we need some evidence.
All right. Let's go. But let's roll it back a bit. Roland Dumas, the former French foreign minister in the Sarkozy government, has been saying on French television for the last week or so that he was approached by British officials at an international meeting before the Arab Spring, and they said, we are going to run an armed uprising in Syria, do you want to join in with us? That's what he has said. Now I put this, if David Cameron is listening, I put it to him, is Roland Dumas, the former French foreign minister, a liar? Or were British officials talking about an armed uprising in Syria before the Arab Spring? That's point number one. Point number two, a US internal military report has been leaked yesterday, which shows quite clearly that the Al-Nusra front were caught by Turkish police inside Turkey with 2 kilograms of non-conventional sarin. Now this, in other words, there is no doubt that the rebels have been using chemical weapons. There is doubt about whether Assad has been using chemical weapons. Nobody's been able to prove it, but the rebels definitely have. And the weaponry they've been using has been shipped to them indirectly from Saudi Arabia. Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia seems to be the source for all of this. Now, if it turns out that our allies, the Saudis, which Filton up here, they sell a lot of things to the Saudis, if it turns out that it's our allies that carried out this chemical weapons attack inside Damascus, which killed 1,500 people according to the Americans, 1,425 I believe, they're very suspiciously precise, is it time for the Royal Navy to get down into the Gulf and bomb Riyadh and overthrow the Syrian regime, the Saudi regime, which kills people with chemical weapons? Slip of the tongue there. I said Syria, I meant to say Saudi. Now, if we're going to grandstand about people not using chemical weapons, of course, the fact that the US Marines used white phosphorus in Fallujah, should the head of the US Marines be put on trial at the International Criminal Court? Or should we just bomb Washington? I think this is an extremely dangerous situation, but I think the Russians have played it very, very cool, very well. Another thing that people haven't noticed, the Russian capability in the Eastern Mediterranean is quite enough to take down NATO's squadrons. And if you think I'm joking, people need to look up what the Russians have been developing over the last 30 years, which is the capacity to take out aircraft carriers. The US has 37 aircraft carriers, Britain has 2. The Russians have now developed, and the Chinese have developed the capability to take out aircraft carriers very quickly and very rapidly.
Yes, they've got their aircraft carrier killer, haven't they, slowly chugging right now across the Mediterranean towards the east.
That's right.
Now, this thing can take out simultaneously, apparently take out 16 aircraft carriers at the same time.
That's right. And that's why all this talk of war may come to nothing, because as the old Roman senator said, if you want peace, prepare for war. And the Russian General Staff has been preparing for war for quite a long time, since 9/11, because they see 9/11 as an inside job. They see it as a false flag attack. And of course, this is NATO's standard modus operandi, is false flag attacks.
I noticed also on Question Time last night, Caroline Lucas mentioned the US and the UK's use of depleted uranium weapons. Now, I mean, chemical weapons, I'm not condoning them at all, but at least after several hours the gas disperses. With depleted uranium, this substance is left in the environment for thousands and thousands of years, and poisons, brings about genetic mutations in generations into the infinite future.
Yes, and I think what people need to realise is it may very well be that our own intelligence services, I mean, the Roland Dumas revelation is the most important one, because he specifically said the British, not the Americans. So MI6, who've got a track record of trying to overthrow governments of Syria, they tried to overthrow the government of Syria in the 1950s. Not many British people know about that. Plenty of people in Syria know about it. And in actual fact, it could be that the whole bloodshed in Syria is an orchestrated plan by our own intelligence services. Now, if it turns out to be the case, then I want to see the leaders of MI6 sent to The Hague. And if they were working on political orders, I want to see the politicians who gave the orders sent to The Hague. Well, that's what's got to happen.
A couple more things. Syria has ratified the chemical weapons ban, and I would imagine that the chemical weapons will be removed from Syria or out of their control once there is some sort of guarantee from the Americans that there won't be an attack. Because I wouldn't imagine that. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Martin? How that might work?
Well, I think what's happened now is that Assad has also put his conditions on, which are that the Israeli. I mean, the reason why Syria has got chemical weapons is because Israel has got nuclear weapons. So if Israel was to try and nuke Damascus, Damascus can say, yes, but we're going to drop a chemical weapon on Tel Aviv, so don't even think about it. So that's why they got them in the first place. Perfectly logical. And of course, the ultimate solution is to have all of these weapons removed from the Middle East, which has been the position of the Iranian government from the very beginning. Not that we hear anything.
I mean, is there any possibility of the Israelis actually putting their nuclear weapons away from use?
No, there's none at all. So you can see from the Syrians' point of view, well, why should we give up our chemical weapons then? But I think Assad is prepared to give up his chemical weapons, not least because his conventional weaponry is pretty robust and his army is winning on the ground. And if it is proved, it has been proved that the rebels have been using chemical weapons. There's no doubt about it. And I think that the ordinary people in America and in Britain need to recognise this. And in actual fact, we are already, when we say should we get involved in Syria, it seems we already are. That SAS chap who was put on trial the other day for having a weapon, an unregistered weapon and so on, it came out during the trial that the last place he had been is inside Syria. Now, what do you think he was doing inside Syria? I imagine he was training rebels to kill, bomb, maim, destroy. And the Syrians would be a bit foolish in the extreme, but well within their rights, if SAS people are involved in killing their soldiers, to come to Britain and kill some of our soldiers. That's what I'd do if I was them.
What about the attack this week on several Syrian villages? Some of them, one of them is apparently one of the places that the only place where biblical Aramaic is still spoken. This was taken over by the rebels, and now the government has taken back control of it with the death of something like 20 or 30 civilians.
Well, the Christian minority in Syria supports Assad. There was actually an internal document leaked, a NATO internal assessment It was their internal assessment of what was going on the ground inside Syria, and it got leaked. And it estimated that Assad had the support of around 70% of the population. The rebels had around 10% support, and the rest were undecided. Now, this is the so-called mandate for the Free Syrian Army and all the rest of it. And ultimately, basically, it looks as if the Western powers, led by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they are Western powers, whether people like it or not, even though 19 of the hijackers on 9/11 supposedly came from Saudi Arabia, although many of them are subsequently shown to be alive and therefore couldn't carry out the hijacking. Why is it that Saudi Arabia, the fount of extremist Muslim terrorism in the world, nobody disputes that, why has nothing happened to them? We just sell them loads of weaponry. Meanwhile, Assad, who was actually being used by the CIA during the rendition program, they were sending him people to torture because he was part of the team. He's got to be bombed, but Saudi Arabia, where all the supposed hijackers came from on 9/11, they get sold weapons. Why would that be? Oh, how many elections have they had in Saudi Arabia? They did, in fact, have a referendum inside Syria, even though there was a civil war going on, which 60% plus participated, but the West just said huff, puff, huff, puff. When was the last referendum in Saudi Arabia or any kind of democratic election? Oh, right, they haven't had one ever. And they're kind of exporting terrorism. Most of the Sunni terrorists inside Iraq that are planting bombs in Shia mosques, they're being armed and trained by the Saudi military. Who arms and trains the Saudi military? Oh, they all go to Sandhurst, don't they? Of course, all those Saudi lieutenants and captains. Who trains them? We do. We do.
Well, we haven't seen a lot of Assad on the BBC, but we will hear from him in a minute. That was on Charlie Rose on CBS. But first of all, let's go back to question time in the House of Commons last week, where Sir Peter Tapsell, who's the father of the House, asked a question about Syria.
Sir Peter Tapsell! As the Syrian tragedy has unfolded, I've always had the Armageddon question in the back of my mind, which I shall now, in an understated form, if I may, put to the Prime Minister. If the Americans illegally bombard the Assad forces, and Assad legally invites the Russians in to degrade the rebels, what will NATO do?
Prime Minister.
Well, the first point I'd make to the right honourable gentleman is that we would never support illegal action, and we just debated and discussed this at some length last week, and it isn't the case that the only way action can be legal is a UN resolution. So we'd only support action that was legal, we'd only support action that was proportionate. As I've said, Britain wouldn't be taking part in any of this action. But in a way, you have to put the Armageddon question round the other way, which is that if no action is taken following President Obama's red line, and if no action is taken following this appalling use of chemical weapons, you have to ask yourself, what sort of Armageddon are the Syrian people going to be facing?
Well, I think Sir Peter Tapsell put his finger right on it there. And of course, if it does transpire that it was the rebels who've used chemical weapons, they've certainly used it before Damascus. And in actual fact, there are suggestions that the children that were shown in the videos were actually the children of regime loyalists from Latakia, who their parents were murdered. They were then given poisoned, not with sarin, but probably with chlorine, and then they were used as a mechanism to cause an airstrike. Now, if it turns out that our own side have been using unconventional chemical weapons, I put this to David Cameron, what should we do then? And if it turns out that MI6 were involved in it, and that you knew about it, Prime Minister, then it's not Assad who's going to The Hague, it's you, isn't it?
So are you suggesting then that possibly some of the children involved in those films were actually captured from the regime side, the parents killed and the children just used in the films and poisoned by some other method?
That's correct.
And whereabouts have you got that?
That was on Voltaire Network, which is a French website. Now, these things have not been verified, but it certainly has been verified that there's been a leaked US military document yesterday which clearly said that the rebels did have and were using chemical weapons. No doubt about that at all. Okay, Assad would be a fool to use chemical weapons. Just the logical thing. He's called in chemical weapons inspectors to look into the rebels' use of chemical weapons. On the day they arrive, the rebels, he supposedly uses chemical weapons on a random neighbourhood, killing loads of children, but no women and no adults. It's very odd. It just stinks, frankly, doesn't it? Like a chemical weapon.
Well, the CBS News network in the United States aired an interview with Bashar al-Assad, and here's a little extract from it now.
The biggest challenge is how can we keep our society as secular as it is today?
As secular?
Secular, the society, not the government. It is secular. You have diversity, very rich diversity in Syria we are proud of. But at the end, you're part of this region. You cannot stay isolated from the conflicts surrounding you. If you have sectarian Lebanon on our west and sectarian Iraq on our east, and you don't have the peace process solved on our southern border, and you have the terrorists dominating the region and let's say growing with leaps and bounds, you'll be affected someday. You'll pay the price. So it's not about being passive and say, I'm going to protect myself. How can you be active and expand what you have to the other? So the challenge is the extremism in this region. They always use religions to assume the mantle of religions or Islam or whatever in order to have followers. They only assume it. I don't think they are convinced about what they are doing. Some of them, they are ignorant, they believe, they think they are helping the religions this way. But at the end, it's not about those, it's about the others. How can they influence? Because, I mean, you always have extremists in everything, in politics, in religions, in Christianity, in Islam, in Judaism. In every religion, you will have extremism. But it's about how much can they influence the society. As long as you have open-minded people, you don't worry about those. They're going to be isolated. That's why I said it's not about who's like you and who's not. This is first, it's about the cause. They have cause, they have to support them. This is first. Second, they're not extremists. But if you mean Hamas...
Hezbollah is not extremist?
No, it's not.
What is it?
They support peace. If you want peace, they support peace. They believe in Islam as to be the government in their country. This is their freedom of this is. I mean, they are free to think whatever they want, but they never try to implement it by force. This is where you cannot label them as extremists. The extremist wants to force you to go in a certain way, and sometimes they threat you, and sometimes they kill you. This is extremism. Not to have your idea. Of course, we're going to have different ideas, different currents, political currents and religious currents. That's normal. And this is the diversity that we have. But they are not extremists because they never try to implement by force their doctrine.
That's President Bashar al-Assad of Syria there talking to Charlie Rose on CBS, Martin. I mean, his main point really seems to be about trying to keep his country secular, and he's having a battle to do it.
Yeah, well, those who are cynical would say that he's just saying that in actual fact he's a dictator and all the rest of it. But the fact is that Bashar al-Assad, the Middle East is a pretty tough neighbourhood, and in Saudi Arabia you have 30,000 political prisoners, and as I said earlier, all 19 hijackers on 9/11 were supposedly from Saudi Arabia. In actual fact, various of these so-called hijackers turned up alive, according to the BBC and the Daily Telegraph at the time. So in actual fact, 9/11 fairly clearly is a security service Gladio style false flag, which is pretty much what looks like this chemical weapons attack.
Well, we keep hearing this term false flag. Just remind us, what does it actually mean?
Originally comes from naval warfare in the 18th century, because of course people didn't, they had telescopes and naked eyes. They couldn't really tell what was happening, especially in fog or rain or whatever. So you creep up to your enemies with a flag. Oh, they're flying a British flag. That's okay. They're one of ours. And then of course when you get close, it turns out that they're French.
And how does that translate itself into what's happened in Syria?
What you do? I mean, the Gladio structures in Western Europe during the 1970s and 1980s were carrying out all kinds of terrorist attacks, which were blamed on left-wing extremists, right-wing extremists, and so on. But of course the real structure was what they called in Italy the strategia di tensione: freak everybody out. There's all these ordinary people being blown up by terrorists, isn't it? We've got to have more police, more army, more control. And it turns out, of course, it's the police and the army who are carrying out the attacks. The Ergonokon network in Turkey worked in a similar kind of way inside the Turkish.
But it's even sometimes intelligence services or to a certain extent, a private security carrying out these attacks on police and even sometimes on the armed forces.
Oh yes. If you're not in the loop, you can be a target. So in Italy, they they killed 2 carabinieri in a car and said, "Oh, the terrorists are killing carabinieri," but it was in fact the government killing.
So in this world, the honest cops have got the most to fear.
Indeed, but they're the only thing between us and chaos. Fernandino Imposimato, I think it is, who's the head of the Italian Supreme Court, wrote a book which came out in December 2012 called La Repubblica dei Strani Impuni, the Republic of the Unpunished Massacres, in which he details all of the attacks that took place in Italy in the 70s and the 80s, carried out by the intelligence services but blamed on others. And of course this is a standard procedure of NATO. Turkey, Ergonokon, NATO. This is what they do.
Okay, staying in the region and also staying with Westminster and Prime Minister's questions this week, Bob Russell brought up a question about Israel, saying that they're ethnically cleansing a lot of Arab Bedouin.
Sir Bob Russell, successive governments have condemned ethnic cleansing. Will the Prime Minister today condemn Israel for its ethnic cleansing of 40,000 Bedouin?
Well, this government has a very clear policy on the issue of Israel and on the issue of settlements. We respect and welcome Israel's right to exist, and we defend that. But on settlements, we think that the Israeli approach is wrong, and we condemn the settlement activity. And we've been consistent in saying that, both privately and publicly.
Well, he's not condemning ethnic cleansing of Bedouin, but he is condemning settlements, Martin.
Well, that has been the British position for 50 years. But of course, in actual fact, we are working quite closely with the Israelis. If there is a war with Syria, it's quite likely that the Israelis will be cooperating with our own armed forces. Maybe it's about time to do to Israel what we did to Serbia in the 1990s. If they won't withdraw behind the Green Line, won't withdraw from Kosovo, then we bomb them, including their TV stations, which tell lies, like we did with the Syrians. Kill their weather girls.
Drive Time on BCFM 93.2.